I'm going to read some bits from the book and tell you some stories about some of those bits and about why I wrote this book and why I wrote it in the way that I did write it. Because it is, as Mari said, a bit of a mix of different things. It's partly memoir, it's partly pathography, so illness writing, and it's partly nature writing. And it was really important to me to blend those three major threads together and have them molded into one thing. Because for me, my experience of the world is all through my body and through my sick body and with my conditions. So every time I experience anything, but particularly the natural world, it's from that perspective. And that's a perspective that I just was not finding in any nature writing, really, that I was reading. The closest, there are some people I think who write really well about embodiment generally, but there were very few people I was finding who was writing about actual illness or disability and nature writing, particularly in the UK. So it was really important to me to do that. Now, I know we have sitting at the back here, Sally. I've realised I don't know how to pronounce your surname. Somebody told me the other day it's Huband. Huband. And Kerry Doherty, who both write really brilliantly about the body and in different ways, different kinds of illness and different embodied experiences too. So I think the ground is shifting and the field is shifting, which is really, really important. But when I first started writing this book, which really was in 2017 that it started to be a book rather than a collection of thoughts, I could not find anybody in the UK who was writing about chronic illness, about disability in nature writing at all. And that might have been that I wasn't finding them, but I just couldn't find it. So I'm going to read you a little bit from the introduction that tells you, it's a kind of reasoning for the book that tells you a bit about why I wrote it and why I wrote it in the way I did. I've written this book because I think the stories we tell and how we tell them are important. I want to change the stories we tell about living with pain, about disability. I know I can't change other people's ways of telling. What I can do is offer a different narrative. In trying to tell my own story, I've turned to the stories that have been important to me along the way, the other narratives of illness and disability that have changed the way I could think about my own, about my life in my body. Stories help us to communicate with others who have different experiences to our own, but they also give us a chance to find ourselves reflected back through other lives. Throughout this book, I include the writing of others, of my extended chronic writing family, from books I've read that gave me that vital sense of recognition, of shared humanity, to books that helped me think through what it means to live well with disability. I couldn't tell my story if they hadn't told theirs. I've written this book because I can tell my story. I hope it will help others who can't or haven't been able to, and help other people tell their own stories too. Maybe if enough of us tell our own stories, we can change the narrative. We can write ourselves back in all our variousness, with our pain, our joy, our mundane everydayness, our truths. This book is for everyone who has been told they are not broken when they are holding up their body full of cracks as evidence. When they are holding up their body, I'm repeating myself, when they're holding up their body full of cracks as evidence. For everyone who has been told there is nothing wrong with them, when they know there is something very wrong with them. Everybody who has been told that they are just too sensitive, that they need to do more exercise or less, that they need to just get outside, reconnect with nature, that they need to take up yoga or prayer, that they only appear to be ill because they are too fat or too thin, that they are making themselves ill, consciously or unconsciously, with their wrong behaviour, that they need to eat more or less or differently, that they have the wrong attitude, that they just don't want to be well. I'm writing this to remember, to record, to testify that my body is real, that my story is real, that this happened and keeps happening that people like me happen. The world is full of us. But mostly I'm writing it for you, because you might be like me or know someone like me. This is for everyone who's been dismissed from further examination because of how they looked, act, spoke, because of their gender, their sexuality, their nationality, their race or religion or ethnicity, their ability, their background. I am not writing this because I think my experiences are in any way exceptional, but because I know they are common, far too common. There are many of you, of us. I believe you. I know you know your body. I know you will find your answer. This book is for you. So that's how the first chapter ends, and it sets out something that's really important to me, but it's very hopeful. And I make all these statements there. I believe that you will find your answer, which I know are also not necessarily true because of my own experiences as well, and the experiences of so many people that I know, and so many people I know of but don't know personally. That part of the reason I wanted to write about this is because of the length of time that it can take people to find out why they're experiencing the world in the way that they're experiencing the world. So one of the central ideas of this book is about time, and about how time is experienced through the body, and particularly through the ill body, and the notion of crip time that some of you may be familiar with. And the time is experienced very differently through the sick body. But part of that, I think, and part of the experience of chronic illness is a kind of looping of time. So there's a lot of looping that happens in this book, both in the structure of it and in the things that it's talking about and the kind of arguments it's making as it goes along as well. And that looping to me was really central to what I wanted to do with the book, but also what I wanted to capture in it as well, because I wanted to capture some of that essence of chronicity, of this kind of repeating ongoingness that happens. And unfortunately, some of that repeating ongoingness is that we all end up looping back around to these same kinds of experiences. In the middle of the book, there's a chapter called Diagnosis. And I realized the other day that I'd stolen that chapter title from one of the seminal books. I had that word seminal, I don't know why I just used it. Mm-hmm. One of the books that was really important to me in thinking about writing about chronic illness, which is Esme Waging Wang's The Collected Schizophrenias. And that starts with a chapter called Diagnosis, which she writes about really amazingly. And I'd forgotten in my kind of fuzzy brain that that's what that chapter is called. But for me, that kind of process of diagnosis needs to be completely rethought. And what we're doing when we think about diagnosis, so both the physical realities of it, but also, I suppose, the philosophy of diagnosis is something I'm really interested in. And I always think back to my sociology supervisor, who is the late, great John Urry, who said to me, in the way of great supervisors, the problem is if you put shit data in, you get shit data out. And I think often the diagnostic process is shit data in, shit data out. So to make that slightly more repeatable, I phrased that in this book as asking the right questions. That if we don't ask the right questions, we can't get the right answers. And too often we do not ask the right questions. And that's as true of ourselves and our own bodies and our own experience of living in the world as it is of the world around us. And I think when we're thinking about some of the pressing environmental issues of the day, as well as some of the pressing social issues of the day, we need to be asking the right questions, or we will never get the right answers. So I'm going to read you a couple of little bits from the diagnosis chapter, which look at diagnosis in a kind of slightly sideways way. So there's a lot of my own stories of times when I was misdiagnosed or undiagnosed in this chapter, which are probably not very nice lunchtime reading, actually. So I will leave those to you to think about by yourself. But I'm going to share two moments with you where things that I met in my daily life made me think about the process of diagnosis and of asking the right question differently. So the first one, I'm taking you to December 2021, so the middle of winter. On the first day of December 2021, I see a deer in the garden at the corner of the road up to the common. The garden belongs to a huge Victorian house divided up into holiday flats. The deer linger in the dense upper reaches of its rhododendron sprawl. At quiet times, they repossess the lawn, grazing on daffodils and sticky buds in the spring. It takes me a moment in the low winter light to realise he is a buck and not a doe. His head is almost bare, 2 dark, shiny coins where his antlers were and will be. His gaze back at me seems tired and curious more than scared. I feel like I'm looking at myself looking back at me. Over the coming weeks, I see him often. So often, I begin to expect him when I walk out into the afternoon. I see him several times in the same spot on the common, his head poking up from where he rests in a sheltered nook on a mossy crag when I walk below him in the boggy gully. I watch his antlers grow from tiny stubs like cartoon bumps to fuzzed columns the height of his ears. They look like they've been dipped in cinnamon sugar. They look like your fingers would sink into them. I begin to measure time by antler. In this bleakest part of the year, their progress seems a kind of promise. Something is moving forward. Something is growing. As January turns to February, his antlers fork into branches. I call him Two Prongs. I am unreasonably proud of his antlers. I take photographs of him and share them online in the way people do of their grandchildren, their pets. Someone comments his true prongs look like furry mittens, and they do. Sometimes he is alone, sometimes with a doe. I think of him as Bucky, her as Lady Swivel Ears, for the way she turns her ears like radar dishes to register my movement. By mid-February, I've begun to think of them as my friends, though in truth they only tolerate me. At the very least, I think of us as neighbours. I have learned their favourite places, where they like to eat, where they like to take a nap. I like to know they are there and okay. I can walk right past them as they're eating and they barely even look up. I see them glance at me, glance at each other and agree, oh, it's only that one, she's no threat, and carry on about their business. I am just another animal passing by. There is a reassurance in this co-tenancy of the land, in this recognition. I have built a whole narrative around these deer in my head. I see them every day. I think I know them. I think we have some kind of understanding. Then on the 22nd of February, I see Bucky and Lady Swivel Ears 3 times on the same walk, in 3 separate, impossible places. I have been seeing 3 sets of deer and assuming they were one. As soon as I know it, it's obvious. They look completely different. They keep to their own territories, have their own habits. One has a much darker coat and is shyer than the others. One has a little bare triangle on his rump. One has distinctive plush coronets where his antlers meet his head, and the pile of their velvet is particularly luxurious. I shouldn't say he's my favourite, but he is. Each has his own unmistakable personality. How could I ever have thought they were the same deer? How could I have been so fooled by my own presumption of knowledge? All these weeks of mistaken identity, because I thought I knew what I was looking at. I saw what I already expected to see. I thought I was observing so carefully, but my observations only confirmed what I already believed. So that sets up then my medical experiences and thinking about some of the strange and quite unpleasant encounters that I had while trying to find out why my experience of the world was my experience of the world. And then something else happens that again helps me think about this in a different way, which I'm just going to read you a bit of. So this is about a tree, a very special and interesting tree. In October 2022, I'm introduced to a toffee apple tree. It's Apple Day. Will and I have gone to meet up with friends at a country estate in North Cumbria with a 17th century hall and grounds packed with plants gathered from around the world over many generations. We're told we can't think of leaving before we see the toffee apple tree that grows behind the hall. At this time of year, and this time only, the tree gives off the scent of caramelised apples. Does anybody know toffee apple trees? No. Well, I didn't either. We smell it before we reach it. Walking along the back terrace of the garden, we hit a wall of sweet and buttery fragrance. The tree stands a little by itself, right at the end of the walkway, its gold and pink leaves vibrating with luminosity against the damp green of the lawn and the heavy grey of the sky. The scent, like lychees and butterscotch, floral and sharp and sweet, is so delicious I want to bathe in it. I climb over the wall of the terrace to stand at its drooping branches, amongst the heart-shaped leaves, and breathe it in. That night, I Googled toffee apple tree. All the time we were being told about it, I was hearing toffee apple tree as a personal name, particular to that specific tree I would stand under, as though it were one of a kind. It did not occur to me it was the common name of a species. Because I'd never heard of it, I couldn't understand what I was seeing, smelling, feeling. So toffee apple tree is one name for Katsura. I would read the Latin name, but I'm not going to. Others are caramel tree, toffee tree, candy floss tree, gingerbread tree, cake tree. We can't agree what it smells of, but we can agree it smells amazing. The next afternoon, I walk up the old road as usual, past the overgrown duck pond towards the coffin path, as I have done on so many days over so many years. This time, a newly familiar scent stops me. I can smell the toffee apple tree. Now I know it, the scent's unmistakable. Ripe honey mango dissolving on the tongue, burnt sugar and peaches. I stand in the road in the mizzle, sniffing and sniffing, and then I see it. Just over the wall of a 19th century garden. In the mizzle, the yellow hearts of its leaves glow with information. 2 days beforehand, as I walked there with Will, I had stopped at the same place, wondered what tree had dropped the soft buttery leaves on the dark tarmac. Hundreds of times I have passed that spot in autumn, smelt the honey lychee scent, and not known what to think of it. I've walked on, knowing nothing about toffee apple trees. I could not turn their presence into meaning. So what I found out when I looked into it was that the tree was growing in the garden of a house that I was slightly fascinated by anyway, because it was built by Anna Deborah Richardson, who came from a prominent Quaker family and was quite important in the setting up of Girton College as well. So she's a really interesting person. Her whole family are really interesting, but she died quite young because she was also chronically ill. Now, I think the Katsura tree postdates her garden by probably 100 years at least, but it made this really interesting link in my mind between these people and these places. And Grasmere was so important to her as a refuge in her illness and as a place that she could be and feel safe and have enjoyment of the natural world. It seemed really interesting. And I recommend both looking up Katsura trees and finding out about them, because there's all sorts of amazing legends about them, but also looking up where there is one local to you. So there are various Katsura trees dotted around the UK, and I recommend go and see one in the autumn because they are something else entirely. But not everyone can smell Katsura's delicate, sweet fragrance. It's the chemical compound maltol mixed with sugar released from the turning leaves that makes the distinctive aroma in autumn. But maltol, used in food and perfumes for its caramelic properties, is not perceptible to everyone. To people who lack the scent receptors, the Katsura in autumn is just a pretty yellow-leaved tree, nothing more enchanting. It could easily be mistaken for a linden, with its own string of legends and enchantments, its own autumn gold. You could walk past the Katsura 1,000,000 times and not know it for what it is, as I did before a chance encounter elsewhere unveiled it to me. You will breathe in its distinctive perfume, but if you do not know a tree can give off scent like that, you will file it away in your mind as incidental. This is also a story about diagnosis. You can see something every day, but unless you have the frame of reference to recognize it for what it is, you will misidentify it, overlook it year after year, no matter how carefully you think you are paying attention. You will assign another cause to what you observe, thinking you are being logical, working only with what you know to be possible. You have to know something exists in order to find it, right next to you, where it always was, to give it its proper name. So that's how a tree and some deer helped me think about diagnosis. And I think particularly helped me think about some of those problems around diagnosis and around those questions of what we know, what we can't know, what we might be moving towards, and being open to possibility that is beyond our current understanding, which for me is so important in the way in which we think about everything in our lives. And I think it's something that maybe a lot of people could do with a little bit more of, that kind of openness of thinking and not assuming you already know stuff. So at that point, I think we could have questions. So if anybody has any questions, as I say, they could be anything from how fluffy are a deer's antlers to tell me a bit more about those leaves or anything in between.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if we go 1, 2, 3, we'll move backwards. You go.
Yeah.
So about diagnosis, we've got like a working diagnosis and a definite diagnosis. Right. So what I understand about working diagnosis is like you revolve around what you know, but it's not certain. So how do the person who's receiving this diagnosis would be like experiencing like this is uncertain, but whether this uncertainty lies?
Yeah, that aspect of uncertainty I think is really interesting and really difficult because, you know, if you are receiving an uncertain diagnosis, it can be quite unsettling. And I think where it becomes a problematic mode, because everything's uncertain until you know the answer, right? So it's part of that process of questioning as well, that we all need to have a working theory or a working diagnosis until we know what the correct answer is. But I think what happens often with chronic conditions is that you get stuck in that phase of working diagnosis, and then no one bothers to look further than that. So a working diagnosis becomes an assumed diagnosis, and then you kind of get stuck, and you never move forward. The questioning stops. And I think that happens with so many people with different conditions for different reasons, because it's easier to stop asking questions. So moving from that phase of uncertainty to some kind of answer, I think is really, that's something that we need to be trying for that, even if we don't think it might be possible in the moment, if that makes sense.
And then can I get you to repeat the next question back?
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So thank you. That was so interesting to hear. I work with medics in a different area. I'm not one. and I'm talking about transcultural psychiatry, we talk a lot about diagnosis, and I'm wondering, and there are lots of questions, and are we doing it right, and how is it working, and so on. I'm wondering if you've had some response from professional medics about what you're saying about your book.
So this is a question about responses from medics about diagnosis, coming from a background of working with transcultural psychiatry. Is that right? Yeah. And how people have responded to that. Interestingly, I've not had that many responses from medics yet. It's only been out for 6 weeks. I've had a lot of responses from chronically ill people who have wanted to tell me straight away that they have found recognition in that process. I have had a couple of people who are medics who have written to me and said, I'm going to give this book to all of my colleagues because I do think we need to talk about this. But not as many. And I wonder if that's because both maybe a lack of urgency, I think, as well in response, but also it's more difficult, I think, when it raises those questions, and it raises those questions about what you're doing in your practice. It's a more difficult thing to respond to, and maybe something you need to go away and sit with for a longer time.
It takes time, I think.
Yeah, I think it does take time, and I can see those conversations beginning, but I think they'll take a while.
Thank you.
And then Kerry, you had a question as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. As you know, I find your receiving absolutely just incredible, and I think it's just gonna change lots of things for so many people. But something that I was been thinking about recently around people who are writing chronic illness, who are writing, say, for instance, like kind of alternative forms of caregiving, and the economy of care, and it just kind of makes me think about that sort of that labour, and how that actually the big discussion at the moment is happening around the publishing industry and how you can actually really inbuild something, because I'm always so wary of what it takes to put a book like this into the world, and actually the aftermath, just that continual re-excavation. It's beautiful to hear from readers, but it's also can be quite devastating as well. And I'm just curious as to, do you have any kind of thoughts around that, like how, and I'm sorry to use that labour on you.
No, that's fine.
In the process of writing it and publicising it, do you have any sort of advice for the publishing industry?
Yeah, definitely. So this is a question about care work, labour, illness, and how that relates to publishing, and how we manage some of the problems of book promotion, of publishing, of self-care in amongst that as well. Self-care and care, some you would hope, care from outside as well. I could speak for hours about that, I think. In some ways, I feel like I was quite well prepared for some of the emotional aspects of that. And so Kerry also talked about the re-excavating of trauma that can happen when you write a memoir, and then you have to continually talk about it, and then continually respond to people talking about it as well. And I think that can be really, really difficult. And one of the strange things, obviously, about memoir is that when people chime with something that's happened in it, they want to tell you about it, and they want to talk to you about it, which is a really natural response, and also kind of what you want to happen as a writer as well. But it is a whole other labour. I keep joking that I'd be a lot better off if I could train my cat to respond to people for me. Because it's amazing to me to get those responses from people, because it was really important to me that this book, I wanted it to do two things. I wanted it to speak to people and inform people who didn't have any experience of illness or disability themselves. And I wanted it to reflect and resonate with people who did. Because, as I said at the beginning, those experiences myself of reading similar accounts or just realising I wasn't alone in some of those experiences meant so much to me, and were things that I wished I'd had earlier in my life as well to help me understand some of that and think through it. So we want that to happen, but it is labour, and recognising that it's both labour and it's incredibly draining, and the problem of living with an energy limiting condition anyway is that everything is draining. Existing is draining, getting dressed is draining, eating is draining. There is nothing that is not draining. So it all just kind of piles up. And I was really aware of that when I went into this process. And because the book is about that, in some ways it kind of gives me a get out clause as well. So I know if chronically ill people are writing to me, that they're also going to forgive me if I take a long time to write back to them, because we all know, we know what it is, which makes it slightly different to, I think, some other kinds of memoirs where, people can be very unforgiving of even writers whose work they're really admiring. They can want a kind of personalised response that just sometimes is not possible, and recognising that might not be possible is really important. What can the publishing industry do is a massive question, and trying to make things more accessible and gentler at every aspect of that is, again, another huge paradigm shift akin to the shift that I'd like to see happening in medicine, to be honest. Because although in many ways my publisher have been very supportive, even things like the very fact that recording the audiobook, it had to be 3 days in a row. I never do anything 3 days in a row. I would never choose to do that, because I know that that's going to cost me a month of recovery time, and it did. But there seemed to be no other way to do that if I wanted to record the audiobook myself, which I did, and I'm glad I did. And rethinking how that works, there's a rigidity which is not helpful. And it's not helpful to people in publishing either, because we've heard a lot also this year about the kinds of stresses and strains that people are under in the publishing industry. And there's been some excellent work done as well on how difficult it is to work in publishing as a disabled person too. That there's a whole shift around that needs to happen. But there's I think always this kind of then sense that because there is this inflexibility, and an inflexibility in the process, the idea that you have to go and do in-person events in order to get the book sales, and everything kind of revolves around a certain strategy of existence. That inflexibility means that it feels exploitative in some ways. So I think it's great that publishing wants to diversify its output and the kinds of people that it works with and the kinds of stories it's telling. But often I think there is a lack of follow through on thinking about the practicalities of what that would mean, and actually being able to support people with diverse needs and diverse backgrounds to work within publishing in a way that isn't harmful to them. It's it feels like a very long answer, but it could go on for days, but maybe I'll leave it there.
Is there another one in the room? Yeah, okay, so we've got 3 more and then 1 online. So if we're going to go 1, 2 and then 3, go for it.
You were talking about how people can suggest something like do yoga and whatever, and then also talking about staying open to learning. And I was wondering, sort of from your perspective, with someone with chronic illness, obviously chronic illness is such a sort of personal thing, and you become sort of your own doctor and your own like master of it. How do you practice staying open to learning about it, while also retaining sort of agency that you have this good understanding of?
That's a really interesting question. So it's a question about, as a chronically ill person, how you maintain openness and learning with your own conditions, as well as the flip side of that. Say it again, how you said it.
Retaining your own agency.
Retaining your own agency and your kind of control over that. That's really interesting, because I think how you relate to what you're doing can shift so much over time. So if I'd written this book 20 years ago, I probably would have written very different things about some of those same aspects, and you know what might be curative, what might be therapeutic, and where I might place myself within that. And I think we are always changing our relationship, both with our bodies and with what you might think of as your kind of illness journey. But then there's this kind of tension, isn't there, between then openness to trying anything to feel better, which is a kind of desperation that many people find themselves drawn to. I recorded a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Jen Scottney, who has this amazing podcast, Resilience Rising. And she is an ultra runner who then became chronically ill and got into debt trying everything that she could to not be ill. And that's a very common experience as well, that people end up, when you're kind of dumped, I think, by the medical establishment sometimes, then trying almost any theory that you can do to try and make yourself feel better. And that can be really dangerous in lots of different ways. But then there is a danger also that you then close yourself off to options that might be helpful. So the kind of try yoga thing as a joke, along with things like have you eaten kale, you know, that kind of thing. There was a great, one of my favourite moments in Twitter ever, probably like 8 years ago now or something. Somebody tweeted, ate a kale, still chronically ill, what gives? And the responses to that was just one of the most joyous things that I've ever read. And it's a joke within chronic illness circles, obviously, because we've all been there, we've all tried it. You know, if you can afford to try different things, you do, because you will, and which is the irony of always being told by doctors that you just don't want to be well. That people are literally trying the most ludicrous things and putting themselves in debt to try to be well, and it's not working. But that doesn't mean that those things can't be helpful to different people. So I think being open to trying different stuff is really important, but maybe not chasing it, if that makes sense. And I think part of that is learning to listen to yourself. And I think that's a lot of this aspect of agency. That's a lot of what I think is taken away from you often in that diagnostic process, that you're often told that you can't trust yourself, and that your body is giving you wrong messages, or you're thinking about it wrongly as well. So you can lose that sense of connection with your own internal responses. And I think kind of refinding that and being able to have honest conversations with yourself about, is this actually useful? Is it not? That's the kind of way forward. That's a very wishy-washy answer. I think there isn't a perfect way through. But I think you need to both keep openness, but also have a strict word with yourself too, as you do it, and not get into debt.
There was another question.
Yeah. Sorry.
So I hate the word aspiring. I hate it. I feel like it's just an end point. I can't think of a synonym here. So I was wondering if you had any like advice for aspiring kind of writers and poets about chronicling. chronicling own experiences of living through disability and living with disability, as well as kind of experiencing, as you said, about experiencing the world through your own body, and that's the only way that you really can. There's no separation. Do you have any advice on writing about that?
So this is a question about advice for up-and-coming writers or beginning writers. Is that rather than aspiring? There was a discussion about the word aspiring being really annoying, which I agree about. Yeah, what are you aspiring towards? It's a very strange idea, isn't it? About writing about chronic illness and how you do that. Do you mean like kind of practically or?
Practically, emotionally, any form of advice?
Yeah. So I guess the most important thing for me would be to just do what you can do. I think that's one of the most important bits of advice, because I think a lot of writing advice is geared towards the kind of getting up at 5 a.m, writing your 2,000 words, doing it every day, kind of daily pages kind of philosophy, which is completely unattainable for most people. Well, for most people full stop, but especially if you're chronically ill. One of the reasons why I think so much writing about chronic illness and about disability is fragmentary is not just because it reflects the experience, but also because that's what's manageable. So kind of thinking about things as little chunks or snippets that you can do in between other things. And just doing what's possible, and not punishing yourself for not being a different person, I think is really important. Both as a way of creating a writing process which is possible for you, and also in maintaining that record and that kind of conversation with yourself as well, because I think sometimes that kind of disappears in the process as well. And to me, the process of writing is really important in making sense of what's happening to me. But there are also times, when I've been my illest, I haven't been able to do that as well. So finding a balance where those two things meet, I think is really important. So not worrying about any of those kind of the external factors, like meeting certain points in your life where you're going to have done this by blah, blah, blah. They're all kind of arbitrary anyway. It's not that important. And just doing what you can do. And focus, for me, always the key is focusing on the work and not worrying about the external bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
There was one more. Was there one more at the back? Yeah. Let's go for it. No, go for it. You go for it.
Yeah, thank you for offering so much of yourself, I guess. I wanted to ask, a lot of this reminded me of like not being able to fulfill expectations rather than outside or inside, like internalized as well. And I was just wondering how your experience, like through time, with that was, and boundaries, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really difficult. So there's a question about not being able to meet expectations, both internal ones and external ones. I touch on in the book the kind of grieving process I think that people go through when they recognise that they are chronically ill, or that they have an acquired disability, or they've just found out they're disabled and actually they always have been. That you can kind of grieve for the life that you thought you might lead, the life that you thought you were preparing for, and that can't be possible for you. And there can be a big kind of sense of FOMO, I think, in that as well, both internally and externally. And I think that never really goes away. I think for me, I've got better at handling that. I was thinking about this recently in terms of the pandemic as well, that I think I was in a much better place with that mentally 3 years ago than I am now, because it's so apparent now for me that I can't exist in a world which doesn't care about illness and doesn't care about disability. And then seeing people return to a kind of pre-2019 life, is like a kind of ongoing bed rest scenario of the soul rather than necessarily of the body, which is a whole other level of that. But I think it's really hard to watch people go about their lives and reach points in their lives that you have had to let go of. And you can get used to it. It doesn't mean it gets easy. It's a bit like living with pain, really, that you get used to it. It's a fact of your existence. You don't have a choice. And you have to find a way to deal with that. But it doesn't mean that it becomes easier necessarily. You just learn to manage it. And I think everybody has to learn that in their own way. As you do with any disappointment in life, you have to find the way that you can make it okay for yourself. And for me, it's about kind of compensations that come from my life and all the beautiful things in it that I wouldn't have if I wasn't ill, that I would have a completely different kind of life probably. But I also wouldn't be me, so, you know, what does it mean then? And sometimes I get sad about things that I can't do, but then I can be happy about things that I do have and that I can do. So for me, it's that kind of balance. But it can be really hard, and there are times still where I will throw a tantrum and just cry for a day. Mm-hmm. And I think you also need to do that and let yourself have those spaces too.
I'm conscious we're very short of time, and I do want to give one of the online audience, but if you stick around afterwards, you can always ask Polly a question then. Sarah had asked online, can you speak to medical misogyny and some of the gendered dimensions of chronic illness or sharing such a personal journey of illness?
Yeah, definitely. So that was a question from online from Sarah about medical misogyny and gendered aspects of misdiagnosis. There's been so much documented now, and so many brilliant books that have looked into this, and the fact that women's pain particularly is dismissed, and the kinds of procedures that maybe you're expected to undergo, being told it'll just be a little bit uncomfortable, that as uncomfortable is not the word for. And I think there is a kind of massive problem with the way medicine thinks about women and about female experiences, and kind of genders that in very strange ways as well. So in that little bit that I read at the beginning, this idea that women are just too sensitive, so you kind of feel stuff and it's not real. But then that kind of turns over when you think then about how race plays into that as well, that often black women are told that they can't feel pain. So white women are told they're too sensitive, so are feeling too much that isn't there. And then black women are assumed not to feel pain at all, which is the flip side of the same problem. And there are so many areas in which different groups for different and intersecting reasons are just massively mistreated by assumptions that occur within the medical system. And I think they all kind of just need to, we need to stop making these kinds of assumptions about people, essentially. Even like assumptions that like men don't talk about their pain, that kind of thing is also a silly assumption. And all of those need to be dismantled. But it doesn't mean that women often, it will take a lot longer for someone to get a diagnosis if it's the same condition with a woman or a man. But I think it's more complex than just gender as well. There's a lot of other factors that go in towards that. But medical misogyny is a massive problem. And yeah, there needs to be a lot of work on that.
Yeah, thank you. We are out of time. But you're not running off anywhere.
No, I'm not disappearing, so if you want to talk to me,
yeah, come on up.
hang out.
And we do have copies of the book at the front. You can come up and get a book signed. Thank you to everyone who watched online. Thank you to all of you for coming out on this hot Edinburgh day to hear about this extraordinary and beautiful book. And thank you, Polly, for sharing everything and for writing it.
Thank you.
Will you all join me in giving a big round of applause? and get a book signed. Do you have a swanky ball pen? Or
I do, but I've left it downstairs.